Now, this course technically begins in 1850, but of course, being history, I always have to give you kind of the background before. But the dynasty then that is actually ruling China in 1850 is called the Qing Dynasty. And that's going to be the last dynasty in Chinese history. Now, the Qing Dynasty, though, is different than other dynasties, or most other dynasties, with the exception of one. And that's because it was not a native Chinese dynasty. In other words, the Qing Dynasty, the family, remember dynasty refers to the family that rules, were not Han Chinese. They were a different ethnic group. So here's basically what happens. The Mongols originally ruled China in like the 13th century. They did not do a very good job and made the Han Chinese people very angry. So their dynasty only lasted about 70 years. It was overthrown by native Chinese, Han Chinese. Actually, it's fascinating. It's a guy who was a peasant who would overthrow them and establish a native Chinese dynasty called the Ming Dynasty. And Ming, you may remember in our Chinese character lesson, we looked at the meaning for sun, and there was also the moon there. If you put those two characters together, it means bright, and those are the characters used to mean Ming. So this is the bright, the luminous dynasty that is illuminating China after the darkness of being ruled by these barbarians. Right, so you had this Yuan Mongol dynasty that had ruled China very unsuccessfully, did a bad job of it, so they didn't last long, overthrown by a native Chinese dynasty, which will take the name Ming. And they will do a good job. They'll rule for almost 300 years. However, there is a dynastic cycle. There are some fairly poor emperors at the end of the Ming dynasty, though sadly not the last one. The poor last emperor, he was actually a pretty good emperor, but he had to pay for his ancestors' mistakes. The Ming will go into decline. There will be rebels who will rise up in China and overthrow it. However, if you look at that map of China, you look at the north, right, you see Beijing and you see the Great Wall, and you will see that there were two groups of people who were invading China. One group was the Mongol, and another group, you'll see on the right, it says Jurchen, and then in parentheses it says Manchus. Right, that area of what is now northeastern China is often referred to as Manchuria. It's a very big area. I think it's about the size of California or France and Germany combined, so it's a big place. And the ethnic group that lived there, or the major ethnic group that lived there, were often called Jurchen, and later they would change their names to the Manchus. When this Han Chinese rebel overthrew the Ming, the Manchus presented themselves as the avengers of the overthrown Ming and invaded China. Right, so you've got this usual dynastic cycle that is going on. Right, you had the Ming dynasty had gotten weak. It had lost the mandate of heaven. It had been overthrown by a Chinese rebel who, having won, clearly must have the mandate of heaven. But then this group of people, these Manchus, will invade, presenting themselves as avenging the overthrown Ming Empire. And they will establish in 1644, with the crowning of their emperor in Beijing, a new dynasty that will govern China, the Qing. They actually declared it a little bit before that, but that's when they can really kind of claim it's been solidified. So now you have a new dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. And I cannot overemphasize this. This is very important. It can be kind of tricky, but we have to understand this. China is mostly Han ethnicity. There's an ethnic group in China called the Han. About 95% of Chinese are Han, but not all Chinese are Han. And these people were traditionally where the emperors came from. But now they are ruled by people that they see as foreigners, as barbarians, these Manchus who have declared a new Qing dynasty. So we have to understand, right? China is a multi-ethnic country or empire, depending on the time period we're talking about, in which the majority Han typically dominated because they were like 95% of the population. And they were not happy that they had been conquered by the Manchu, who had established this new Qing dynasty. And this wasn't simply saying, oh, this is a different ethnic group. They literally saw the Manchu as barbarians. The Manchu did not speak or write in Chinese. They had their own language. They had their own customs. They did not generally follow Confucianism. They had their own religious practices. So many Han Chinese looked at them and said, these people are barbarians, right? These people are different from us. And remember, in traditional Chinese thought, where you connect culture, civilization, morality, being different from us is being wrong and being bad and being barbaric. So many Chinese people then said, how could these barbarians possibly have the mandate of heaven? No way did heaven choose these people to be our new emperors, to be the new dynasty to rule China. So this led many officials, many elite people, refused to serve in the Qing government. They said, we will not serve you barbarians. Our loyalty is to the Ming. Even more important, even more dangerous in a sense, some people rose up in rebellion. And the Qing dynasty were constantly facing rebellions by people who were pro-Ming, who wanted to restore the Ming. This is not a recipe for stability or order, right? China is a huge place. There's not that many Manchu. If the Qing dynasty wants to actually rule, it needs to figure out a way to make these Chinese people accept their rule. And we have to stress, again, the Qing dynasty is going to last almost 300 years. So they did figure out how to do this. But this is a serious issue that they have to overcome. How do they convince the Chinese that they're not barbarians and that they have the mandate of heaven, and therefore the Chinese should stop rebelling against them and should start serving them? And the best way to kind of show how this will happen, how the Qing will successfully convince the Chinese to accept their rule, is to look at one of the most important of the Qing emperors, the Kangxi emperor. The Kangxi emperor was a remarkable man. He came to power, I believe, when he was about 12 years old. And there were people who wanted to kill him, to get rid of him, so they could put their son or whoever on the throne. And he managed not only to survive all that, he managed to govern China very well for a very long time. And the way he did that was to adopt Confucianism. You can see that in this picture, right? If you compare this picture with the previous one, right? The previous picture, you had a Manchu on horseback in a way that Chinese would say, oh, that person's a barbarian. But in this picture, the Kangxi emperor is wearing a scholar's robes. He's not dressed as you might expect an emperor to be dressed, right? He's dressed very simply. And he's got a book on his lap, and he's got books behind him. That marks him as a supporter of Confucianism, right? This is a person who believes Confucianism is a good thing. And he's very careful to present himself in this way to his Chinese subjects. Now, he will present himself to other people, other ethnic groups, in different ways, as will other Qing emperors. But the key thing is, when dealing with the Chinese, he presents himself as a Confucian. He also will give special exams in order to try and recruit talented people. And these exams, many people will eventually come to take these exams because they see him as a Confucian. And he will give special rewards to scholars. And he's just very clever. So one thing he says is, okay, I know you all like the Ming a lot. So I'm going to give you the job of compiling the history of the Ming Dynasty. Now, if you're a scholar who is loyal to the Ming, that's a tempting offer, right? Because you're going to be able to get a job and work. You know, it's nice to work. It's nice to have a job. But you'll be able to serve the Qing by talking about how great the Ming were. And this works, right? This adoption of Confucianism, this giving carrots to the rewards to the scholars, so that they'll be willing to serve in the government. Remember, to be a government official in China, you basically have to be a scholar. This will be accepted. And what will happen is China will develop this kind of bi-ethnic rule where the emperor and most high officials, but not all, will be Manchu, while the exam system will be still used to recruit Han Chinese, and there will still be many positions open to them, enough positions that most Han Chinese are happy and accept the system. And this is key to why China looks the way it does now. If you look at this map, the Ming Dynasty, even though it was gigantic, comparing it to Western and Central Europe, it's only a small part of what is now China, right? And that's the part that has those backslashes. But what happens is when the Qing, who are from Manchuria, conquer China, they're successful at bringing stability there. So they'll go on to conquer Mongolia. They will establish a protectorate in Tibet, and they will be able to conquer Xinjiang. And with the exception of Outer Mongolia, which is Mongolia today, that's what the borders of China look like. So basically what happens is the Qing will make China a part of their empire. And then when the Qing Dynasty falls, China will successfully claim all the territory except for Outer Mongolia as their own. So that's something to keep in mind. But also, like I said, what's key here that we have to understand is that the Qing accepting Confucianism, at least for their Chinese subjects, allows them to maintain stability in China, to use the resources of China to go out and continue to expand. And what happens then is the Qing are able to bring peace and stability to China eventually. So by the 18th century, there is growing prosperity in China. Things are going very, very well in China under Qing rule. The population will go up, and it will also become more dense. There'll be more people living in cities. And when that happens, you have an increase in culture and material goods, right? When you have people living in cities, you can have mass production, you can have theaters and dramas and poets and novels and things like that. So Chinese people under the Qing, their lives will get better. They will become more prosperous, and they will have access to more and better material goods and access to cultural opportunities they maybe wouldn't have before. Now, one thing we have to emphasize is that the China, especially Qing Dynasty China, is a huge place. It is gigantic. So there's always going to be some place where there's people who don't have enough food to eat. There's always going to be some natural disaster that hurts people. But the key thing is that the government is actually able to address those problems and address them quickly, right? Chinese people were reasonable. They did not expect that there would be no problems under an emperor's rule, but they did expect that a good emperor would intervene on their behalf when bad things happened. In the 18th century, you had a period of general prosperity, and even when there were problems, the government would step in and help out. And that is a sign of having the mandate of heaven.